Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome everyone to the fourth webinar of the series on design elements for demand-side or end-user subsidy framework. My name is Marcel Raats. I'm the team lead for energy and climate in the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, or RVO as it is called. And within RVO, it's Department for International Development. And it's within that team that the cooperation with GIZ on the Energize and Development Program, or the NDEF program, is placed. I was asked to moderate you through this webinar today, which of course I will gladly do. There are still participants coming in. I propose we don't wait for additional participants. They will join us whenever they're ready. So allow me to take you briefly through the agenda for the day. It's on. We're going to have a session of about 75 minutes. I'll try to keep time as good as I can. So what are we going to do? After a short background presentation on exit strategies by my colleague Mirte van der Spek, we've got three very interesting speakers presenting about 10 minutes each on their experiences on end-user subsidies, and in particular, their exit strategies. So let me welcome to the call Shruti Sharma, who is a Senior Energy Policy Advisor at ISD, Landa Abudu, who works at the Nigeria Rural Electrification Agency, where she's the component lead for solar home systems in the Nigeria Electrification Project, and Ashraf Hussain Bhuiyan, who is the Assistant Vice President at ITCOL in Bangladesh, who's also the fund manager of the Malawi Off-Grid Market Development Fund. So welcome to the panelists. After the presentations, we'll have ample room for questions and answers, in which I hope all of you will participate really actively. Questions can be posted in the chat, also during the presentations, and we'll try to pick them up in the discussion. And besides that, the speakers will also try to respond in the chat as well. Maybe to start with, and Brenda, maybe you can pull it up. We can start with a quick poll to see who's on board today. So as soon as and there it is, as soon as the poll question pops up, please share with us your affiliation, whether you're from a government institution, whether you're a private sector operator, work for a development agency or development finance institution, whether you're a member of an NGO or the illustrious other category. In order for us to get a bit of an idea on who's on board today and who's in the audience and what kind of questions probably also we could expect. So I'll give you a couple of seconds for that. It's not a really difficult question. And then we'll ask Brenda to bring up the results. Brenda, are the results already in? And can you share them with us? So it's relatively well spread. There's a bit of a larger audience from the development agencies and development finance institutions, but otherwise I think it's a pretty good spread between government, private sector, NGOs, and of course the other affiliations. So let's continue. Maybe we go to the next slide, Brenda, if you allow. Briefly on the end-user subsidy lab, for those who are not yet familiar with it from earlier webinars. The end-user subsidy lab is a partnership between ESMAP, COGLA, the Clean Cooking Alliance, and NDEF, and promotes the uptake of well-designed, as it is called, end-user subsidies. Subsidies that have the aim of reaching segments of markets that cannot be reached by regular market activities, and of course aiming to leave no one behind. It does so by a variety of activities, by crowding in expertise, mainly offering a platform for exchange and dialogue, as we're doing today. And it collects and shares lessons learned on demand-side subsidies. But it does more. It also actively tests designs and prototypes in the field, feeding again the discussion in the end-user subsidy lab. Please also take note of the web address at the bottom of the slide, for all the resources and reports of the lab are shared for anyone who is interested. Next slide, please, Brenda. So what about the webinar series? The end-user lab is currently working on a demand-side subsidies design tool that will be launched in the first quarter of next year, and in which the discussions of a series of webinars will feed into, including the one of today. The toolkit was designed by the lab, identifies 5 important elements in the demand-side subsidy framework, which are applied in the design for off-grid solar and clean cooking pilots in meanwhile 4 NDEF countries, which are except for one, I think, are all already active in the market. The idea is that once published, the design framework will be tested again in more countries than the 4 pilots we're working on at the moment. This webinar series has discussed each of the elements which are on the right-hand side of the slide. Has discussed each of these elements of the design framework. So the first webinar was on targeting of subsidies. The second one was on what are the eligible products and what are appropriate subsidy levels for that. The third one was on how do we deliver a subsidy and how do we verify the subsidies and the sales that have been made with these subsidies. And the one of today is how do we exit on demand-side subsidies once the results of the project or the results of the intervention have been reached, or do we exit, or is there another way of continuing? Recordings of the webinars, that's a household message. Recordings can be found on the webpage on the Gobler website, the page on the EUSL. And as I said, today we'll discuss the exit strategies. As also said, your questions and comments are really welcome. Please provide them in the chat box, and we will take them up in our further finalization of the toolkit. So before our speakers will dive into their experiences and share their lessons, my colleague Mirte van der Spek will briefly explain what we mean with exit strategies and energy access. Mirte, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'll explain a bit on what we understand by exit strategies, and noting that we use the wording demand-side subsidy and end-user subsidy interlinked. It means the same, and a direct price reduction for a customer. So exit strategies, one of them is one of the most critical components when designing a demand-side subsidy. And since demand-side subsidies are aimed at addressing the affordability gap and ensuring no one is left behind, it could be unrealistic to expect that subsidies are no longer needed when achieving your project targets, or even when achieving the goal of universal energy access. Nevertheless, a program-level exit strategy in the context of demand-side subsidies means that one has to address what next steps should be taken when a program comes to an end. And we define 3 potential exit paths. The first one is a subsidy is no longer needed and a commercial market can take over. The second one is that a new program will be designed for the next phase, so to follow up. Or the third option is that long-term subsidies are envisioned through, for example, a revolving facility or cross-subsidization. Next slide, please. So, explaining a bit more on the first option, subsidies are no longer needed. When a program has achieved its targets and the subsidy is no longer needed, a commercial market can take over. In the context of demand-side subsidies, that means that all households have access to Tier 1 lighting and clean cooking products. Customers then who received a subsidy to purchase a product should be able to afford a replacement if, for example, the battery stops working. And the exit strategy should ensure program goals are met and there is a successful transition to the private sector. And I think one of our speakers from ITCO will explain a bit more on how they did this in Bangladesh. The second option, a new subsidy program. Subsidy programs are designed to operate within specific timelines and budgets, but can transition into new programs. And what we now see is that demand-side subsidy programs often start with a pilot. And while the exact scale-up of this pilot might not be known from the start, we do believe that it's quite important to set this strategy from the start to ensure realistic objectives and communication is done properly. Clear communication for the transition from one program to another is critical towards both the private sector and towards customers. And then next slide, please. And the third option, long-term subsidies. When designing a subsidy, it's more important to consider what recurring subsidies, if any, may be needed to sustain universal energy access. This might mean that an outright subsidy over time becomes a cross-subsidy, or a long-term revolving facility is established. And where longer-term subsidies are envisioned over time, programs should consider how these can be sustainably funded and operated. And then lastly, the phasing out of subsidies. Because regardless of the long-term exit strategy, when designing a demand-side subsidy, one needs to consider how to stop the subsidies within a specific program. One could choose for a gradual phase-out, transitioning towards a narrower targeting, or reducing the subsidy over time could be options. And once again, key to an exit strategy is an appropriate communication mechanism. This is again critical for both households and participating companies, especially for the latter. They need this information to plan their operations. And where subsidies are no longer needed, a gradual phase out allows for a more gradual takeover of the private market. Lots more to be said on exit strategies, but I think this is our brief technical background on what we understand as subsidies. So over to you again, Marcel.
Yeah, thank you, Mirte. It doesn't do just to the complexity of the matter in just a couple of minutes, but I think you gave a good of a bird's eye view on what we mean and where we think about, or where one should think about when it comes to exit strategies. So maybe we go to the next slide, Brenda, please. As I said, as explained earlier, we're really seeking for your input to finalize the design toolkit. And for that, we will try to focus the session, or the rest of the session, and also the discussion on the following key questions. How to mindfully design an exit strategy that is aligned to project targets. The question whether or not long-term subsidies are required to ensure sustainable and universal, of course, energy access. And can subsidies actually be phased out after the target is achieved, or is there a need for more long-term involvement from the subsidy measure, as we are talking to or working with fragile and poor consumer groups? So maybe to the next slide, and I would therefore like to invite the first panelist of today, Ashraf Hussain Bouyan from ITCOL, to talk to us about the subsidy exit approach in ITCOL Solar Home System program in Bangladesh. Ashraf, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcel. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I hope I am clearly audible. So, as indicated by Marcel and Marta, I am going to discuss about the solar home system program that we implemented in Bangladesh, where we subsequently phased out our subsidies and exited. So, next slide, please. So, just a brief overview of ITCOL. So, the full form of ITCOL is Infrastructure Development Company Limited. So, we are a fully government of Bangladesh-owned financial institution that was established with a specific mandate to catalyze private sector participation, specifically infrastructure and renewable energy projects in Bangladesh. Over the course of time, we were established back in 1997. And since then, we have actually become the largest development financial institution in Bangladesh that catalyzes private sector investment in the infrastructure projects. And we are actually also the first direct access entity of the Green Climate Fund from Bangladesh. And so far, we are only one of the two national implementing entities of the GCF funds. And very recently, we have also started working as fund managers in two separate World Bank funded projects, one in Malawi and one in Ethiopia. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about our genesis of the ITCOL Solar Home System program. So it was actually one of the very first pilots that World Bank initiated in Bangladesh back in 2003. So before that project, Bangladesh's rural electrification rate was only around 24%. And the pace that our utilities were taking during at that point of time, it was going to take a few decades to achieve the 100% electrification target. So considering that in mind, Government of Bangladesh and the World Bank started out the first pilot of the 5-year project, which is called the Renewable Energy and REREDP, Rural Electrification and Renewable Energy Development Project. So under this project, there was one component that looked at grid densification, and there was another component that looked at off-grid electrification. And since it was a pilot, so the World Bank decided that we are going to test two models. One was a fee-for-service model, which was being implemented by the Bangladesh Rural Electrification Board, or BREB, which is a government-owned entity. And the second was to follow a more competitive microfinance-based sales model, which ITCOL was implementing. So when we actually started our implementation together, but then ITCOL actually reached its targets within just 3 years from the starting date. Whereas BREB, with their fee-for-service model, they installed almost close to 12,000 solar home systems, which later they discontinued. Seeing the success of the project, both the World Bank and later on the other development financial institutions provided additional financing to ITCOL, and eventually ITCOL Solar Home System Program became the largest off-grid renewable energy project that is implemented, with 4.1 million solar home systems implemented over the course of 16 years. Next slide, please. So I'm going to very briefly talk about the business model that we implemented. So we actually mobilized off-grid solar companies. We call them participating organizations, who were mostly NGOs and microfinance institutions, who have actually rural networks and experience of marketing, selling, and then financing and servicing solar home systems. So the reason that we implemented through this network, because as you were well aware that Bangladesh pioneered the microfinance through our Nobel laureate Dr. Mohammad Yunus, and these microfinance institutions already had the necessary networks to go into the deeper rural regions. So we provided concessional financings, loans, which were provided to these POs, which actually enabled them to offer loans to the customers, microfinance loans, that is going to spread out the payments over a period of up to 10 years, up to 3 years. And these loans, they were concessional in nature. So in the beginning, we actually did not take that much securities. So that actually demanded a very rigorous and regular monitoring of the project performances of these participating organizations. And we also provided grants in the form of subsidies, as well as institutional development grant, which I'm going to discuss in the later slides, which actually we phased out and declined over time. And the purpose of this grant was to increase the affordability of the solar home systems, and as well as to strengthen the institutional capabilities of the PO. And ITCOL accessed through the necessary funding through the government with the support from the development partners. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I'm very briefly going to highlight the mode of financing. So in here, this is actually a financing model for a 20 watt peak solar home systems. So as you can see, it was, so the price that you're seeing in here, US $110, it's actually a price back from 2017. And we also have to keep in mind is that ITCOL in Bangladesh, we actually had the privilege that only the solar panels had to be imported, because other than that, the appliances, the batteries, the inverters, charge controllers, everything were locally manufactured. So we provided buy down grant, or in the form of end user subsidy of US $20. And after that, the system price for the households were 90. And the households were required to pay 15% down payment. And then the $76.5, as you can see in the slides, is a loan which the customers paid over a period of 3 years. Now, ITCOL actually also wanted these companies to inject their own equity into the project, and we actually financed 70 to 80% of this loan that our customers are repaying over 3 years period. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I'm going to discuss about the grants that we have provided. So as I indicated, we provided an end user subsidy that was designed to increase the affordability of the rural households, which we termed it at that point of time as capital buy-down grant. And we also provided an institutional development grant, which is a small grant to help these participating organizations at the initial phases to establish their retail service infrastructures. Now, the amount of subsidy, end user subsidy that we provided was same for all sizes. And the purpose of this was that we actually wanted more subsidy to be channeled toward the poorer households, since the poorer households actually demanded the smaller SHS systems. And as you can see on the slide, is that over the period of 16 years, we have provided in total 78 million grant in total, which actually declined over the period of time. Next slide, please. So in here, as you can see how we phased out the subsidies. So at the initial period in 2003, we provided capital buy-down grant or the end user subsidy as $70 per unit, whereas the institutional development grant was 20. So initially, in total, almost $90 were provided as a subsidy or a grant to these households and the companies. But over the period of time, we actually reduced the amount of institutional development grant that we were providing. And from 2012, we actually phased out the institutional development grant. Whereas we were seeing the end user subsidy, there was actually a need for the end user subsidy as we went along. But what we have decided is that we actually needed to transition the project in a more commercial phase. So we decided that only from 2013 onwards, we are going to only provide $20 per unit of subsidy, which will be only for the smaller solar home system program. So for smaller solar home systems with the system capacity of 20 watt peak or lower. And as we phased out the subsidies, what we also did is that we transitioned our loan terms into a more semi-concessional credit. So in the beginning, we provided 10 years loan with 2 years grace period with an interest rate of 6%. But as we reduce the subsidies, we also actually reduce the loan tenors as well as increase the interest rate up to 9% at one point of time. And we also increase the equity requirement for the companies. So they wanted to inject, they were needed to inject 30%, whereas ITCOL actually provided 70% of financing as a semi-concessional credit. Next slide, please.
You've got 2 minutes left, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I only have, I think, 2 slides as well. Thank you, Marcel. So the success factors, so as I indicated earlier, is that we actually provided an ownership model with subsequent with participation from the private sector. And we actually also facilitated timely installment collection through our rigorous quality monitoring system. And one of the another aspect was continuation support from the government and the development partners, which actually facilitated our subsequent phase out of the subsidies that we implemented. And we actually also tapped in, as I indicated earlier, our microfinance experiences that facilitated credit-based sales. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide. So considering our approaches in Bangladesh, we have actually been supporting the Ministry of Energy in Malawi for implementing a similar off-grid electrification project. So it is also being implemented by the World Bank, which is similar to Bangladesh. It's one of the very pilot projects in Malawi. So it is called the Off-Grid Market Development Fund that has the target to electrify 200,000 households by June 2024. So following the successful end-user subsidy implementation in Bangladesh, we actually also adopted a similar end-user subsidy design, which is a $20 for all size of solar home systems. And again, similar to Bangladesh, what we did is that we wanted the subsidies to be targeted towards more poorer households. And in our subsidies, it is a result base. So we actually, in our grant agreement, we specifically designed some of the grant eligibility criteria. And our disbursement have started, and within just 2 months of time, we have actually managed to disburse almost half of our loan that we were originally planned to design. We were originally planned to disburse. So I will stop here. I can attend the questions later on. I can see some of the questions been popping up. So Marcel, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashraf, for a really interesting presentation. And actually, it's not really fair that you have to press 10, 15 years, 20 years of experience in only 10 minutes. But it's really encouraging to see that all the lessons that you've learned already in Bangladesh are now taking forward to other countries like Malawi, but also on your slide to Ethiopia. So very much, and I look forward to a discussion, and then people can ask more questions to you as well. Without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Shruti Sharma for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, who's going to take us through her lessons learned on exit strategies, if I'm not mistaken, on fossil fuel subsidy reform. Shruti, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Marcel. And thank you for inviting me here. So hi, everyone. I'm joining from Bangalore, and I'm going to talk about some of the examples of successful, unsuccessful exit strategies on fossil fuels, largely examples from India, but spanning over the last decade. Next slide, please. So just to set the context, fossil fuel subsidies have grown enormously at the last sort of stock-taking exercise that we did at ISD. We found that they crossed over $1 trillion, largely driven by vast consumption subsidies, particularly due to the energy price crisis that we saw the last 2 years. But we also know, and I know this topic has been covered in targeting webinar that was held earlier that what I mentioned, but universal subsidies are not the most efficient way to help the poor, and we saw a lot of governments kick in universal subsidies. So let's talk a little bit about what exit strategies have worked in the past. So on the next slide, I want to talk about a little bit about how we get the prices right. And often if we get the prices right, it's an easy, open pathway to sort of exiting from subsidies. So on the next slide, I've got an example of diesel subsidies and how the government in India reformed diesel subsidies about a decade ago. So next slide, please. One of the big ways of sort of the successful reform of diesel subsidies was a very gradual approach to price hikes and not a big bang approach, because the big bang approach failed a few times, actually. So the government has burnt its fingers a little and learned its lesson. Help you understand how diesel is sort of placed in the whole Indian economy. About a decade ago, diesel was the single largest petroleum product that was consumed out of all petroleum products that were being consumed in the economy. And 3/4 of it was going into the transport sector, being consumed by trucks, freight vehicles, large cars, SUVs, railways. And because diesel is refined in the country from imported crude oil, because India imports at that time as well, a decade ago, and continues still today, about 80% of the crude oil is imported by the country, it started impacting the import bill, sort of direct impact on the government's finances. So to sort of design the reform, the government really entrusted an internal committee within the government to sort of understand what would happen if a price reform was set in place. And this internal committee sort of recommended a monthly price hike, so small incremental price hikes over a series of months, so leading up to a year. But the government was really sort of risk averse, and it halved the recommended prices. So imagine like less than $0.50 or a monthly ₹1 price hike that is happening, and increase the time span of the reform. So from 1 year, the reform is taking place over 2 years. And what they did was, initially, when we saw a lot of media reports of like typical pushback against price hikes, but over the years, over the span of the 2 years, you kept seeing the news blurb reporting the price hike, like kept decreasing in size, and ultimately it was just a blurb that, it's just information. A big reason for the reform sticking on is that even though after 1 year, when the reform was kicked off in motion, there was a national election and there was a change in government, but the new government did not sort of take away the reform. It sort of kept it in motion. So it did see through its whole life or a proper exit after 2 years. What the government did not do was it didn't fully decontrol the price. So even though we saw the retail price was matching international market prices, it did not fully take away the regulation around it. So we often around election time still see the government intervening a little bit in pricing, but not it. So it didn't give away complete control. On the next slide, I've got some examples about more around how the government sort of assessed impact around price hikes, particularly for two consumer groups that were really sort of challenging. The first one was farmers and the second was the trucking industry. And now for both of these consumer groups, diesel costs or like the fuel costs are a large share of their operating costs. So for farmers, they used at that time and still continue a large share to use diesel for irrigation. So they're vulnerable to the price hikes that the government was sort of putting forward. And similarly for the trucking industry. The trucking industry is responsible for transporting food. So the government was really worried about food inflation and food price hikes. But the government really spent a lot of time in sort of modeling exercises to understand what is the short-term inflation impact from these monthly price hikes. And then it found out that there was short-term inflation, but that disseminated over the period of the 2 years. So it didn't really contribute to any inflation. Any food price hikes that we saw during that same time period were linked to sort of other factors like lack of rainfall, shortage of rainfall, leading to sort of lower crop productivity. So that was a big successful exit strategy, managing the prices. On the next slide, I want to sort of talk a little bit about how an exit strategy can be managed if it is proper. Next slide, please. So we know that, and I know there's a lot of text on this slide, but I won't go through it all because I know some of it may have been covered. But to give a context, I spoke about on the first slide how universal subsidies are just inefficient in helping the poor. Because larger or sort of wealthier households tend to consume more energy. If there are universal subsidies, the wealthier households will consume more energy and then contribute or sort of consume a larger share of the subsidy pie. So what you see on these pie charts is larger households, wealthier households, the purple ones, consuming more gasoline, more LPG, more kerosene, and then even a fuel like kerosene, which is supposed to be for the poor, they end up consuming a large share of the subsidy. So just the poor are disproportionately impacted by price hikes, and they also don't benefit from universal subsidies. On the next slide, if we have to sort of better target subsidies, so then what are some of the strategies that the government has used? Now, these are real examples that the government has experimented with. So they've tried direct cash transfers, sort of remove the utility completely from the middle, and directly the government is passing the cash to the poor beneficiaries. This, of course, requires really strong institutional mechanisms to correctly identify who the poor beneficiary is, something that we still see governments lacking. The second is income-based targeting. So subsidies only for, again, households who are earning less than a certain threshold amount annually. Second is the third one is gender-based targeting, where subsidies are given, for example, like LPG subsidies that I'll talk about in a minute, are given to women from poor households. And this creates this whole ecosystem of empowerment that allows women to access a lot of other benefits. You have these voluntary opt-out or opt-in schemes. And by that, I mean the government ran this clean cooking campaign of voluntary giving up the subsidies so that the poor households could be the larger share of the beneficiaries. There was movement on this, but it wasn't really greatly successful. There's an opt-in scheme where if the government starts fresh, like kicks everyone off the subsidy roster and then asks people to opt back in. This also fails sometimes because if the administrative cost of re-registering for the subsidy is too low, then everyone's just going to come back on the system. So it may not really work. And the last one is that we see sometimes in electricity subsidies and cooking subsidies again, is there's an annual cap on how much you consume. And if you're consuming lower than that threshold, then you're eligible for the subsidy. And if you consume more than that, then you're again kicked off the roster. So on the next slide, I want to deep dive into LPG subsidies a little bit. So LPGs are these liquid petroleum gas. It's a byproduct of natural gas or refined from crude oil. And it's sold in these large 14 kgs canisters that people, you see women actually carrying that in rural areas, but in urban areas, it's delivered to your house. It's a door delivery. Now, LPG subsidies are a clean cooking fuel. They have been vital to help shift households away from traditional biomass fuels, so really like protecting women, children under 5, improving the health indicators, removing indoor household air pollution. So it's been vital to sort of deliver empowerment benefits because the government targeted women from poor households for the subsidy, increased health indicators. So it really experimented with a range of targeting measures, income-based targeting, all of the ones that I spoke about on the earlier slide. Now, in spite of this, LPG subsidies continue to really rise, and we see them rising back again. In 2019, they were crossing about $7 billion. But then around 2020, when crude oil price started falling and all these different targeting measures were not really sort of working, what we saw was the subsidized price was now matching what was the international LPG price. So the government automatically just effectively just removed the subsidy owing to low crude oil prices. But it didn't use that low wave of the crude oil price to then set in institutional mechanisms to keep better identifying poor beneficiaries. So it didn't really use that time to, again, like identify who the poor are, how do we define them better, because LPG subsidies are needed for clean cooking access. And since what we see then is that in late 2020 or early 2021, when oil prices started kicking in again, LPG prices again skyrocketed, but the government didn't reintroduce subsidies for a long time, really impacting poor households who couldn't just afford LPG at all and then regressed back to traditional biomass. So we saw a lot of the improvements or the benefits sort of just lost. As of now, in just a few months ago, the government has again reintroduced LPG subsidies. And now again, we are seeing projections of LPG subsidies crossing back to like closer to $8 billion and again being extremely problematic. So this is an example of many attempts at an exit strategy to really, really target the subsidy to the poorest, but it's not really sticking on. I think I have a few more minutes. So maybe just another last example is on electricity subsidies and how regulatory reforms can work. So on the next slide, please. I've got an example of how regulatory reforms, if they're not passed through again, can block subsidy reforms. So what you see here is an election manifesto of a political party offering electricity subsidies up to 200 units free. And what I'm really trying to say here on this slide is electricity subsidies are often captured politically. What typically how electricity subsidies are offered is you decrease residential tariffs and you offset them by increasing the industrial and the commercial tariffs. So it's really cross-subsidizing what's happening here. And political parties typically, before elections, adopt these populist measures of offering a lot of free electricity subsidies, and they offer them in these sort of election manifestos. And what that means is electricity subsidies just keep increasing over the years, leading to a lot of financial unsustainability for the electricity utilities. On the next slide, I want to talk about a little bit about how that regulatory sort of barrier kicks in. So what you have, sure.
Sorry.
So no problem. So you often see political parties sort of influencing the electricity utilities because the electricity utilities have to typically ask the regulator for revising the tariff. And political parties tend to then put pressure on electricity utilities and don't allow them to go to the regulator. If the regulator doesn't receive a request for tariff revision, there won't be any tariff revised. So this is how they sort of enter the whole regulatory structure. On my last slide, I just want to talk about, on the next slide, please, is again, how to understand if you are going to be blocked by additional sort of stakeholders when you're exiting the reform subsidy regime. So for example, we tried to map stakeholders based on their level of influence and the reaction to the last tariff hike. And what we saw was in the electricity sort of sector, we saw industrial consumers on the top left grid have significant levels of influence, and they tend to have better communication and access to the government. So they can take their sort of request to the government. And one year we saw that the government imposed a 30% hike on the electricity tariff. And the next year, when the industry representatives went to the government and made a case for them, there was no tariff imposed on them. Similarly, we see other organizations like civil society, they can really capture the media with a lot of their agitational requests. And even though they might be not directly influencing the tariff setting regime, but they have a larger voice in the media to play. So really mapping out the stakeholder groups and what is their level of influence and their reaction also can help in better designing and communicating the subsidy. Maybe I'll stop there, but thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Shruti. Really insightful. And how do we move from universal subsidies all across the board to subsidies that only target a very specific group of clients, of customers in the market? And also, if we have to re-establish subsidies to ensure that we're not going back into a level where we subsidize everybody across the board. But also, your last slide was quite inspiring to see what is the interest of the different stakeholder groups in this whole dimension of end user subsidies, because everybody's got a stake in that game. Everybody's got an interest, and that's really, when designing your exit strategy, is really important to get everybody's stakes in proper view in order to make the proper decisions. Thanks, great introductions. So our final speaker of today, and then we go into the Q&As, is Ms. Lande Abudu from the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria. Lande, can you please fill us in on the experiences on the Nigerian electrification project? Looking forward.
Yeah, thank you, Marcel, and greetings to everybody. So just a quick overview on the Nigeria electrification project, which, as you probably know, was funded by the World Bank and the Africa Development Bank. Next slide, please. Combined total funding is $550 million. And it's a federal government initiative, but it's very, very private sector led. And that was the focus of it, to catalyze the private sector market and to incentivize private sector developers. So given the energy access challenges we had, the results-based financing model was opted for, and that was the preferred funding mechanism. So it's worthy to note that at the start of the program, the focus was actually on the supply side of things. But for this webinar, some of the lessons that we learned towards meeting the demand side and then also trying to plan for an exit for it on a follow-on program. So next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the combined funding, obviously speaking to the metrics that we wanted to improve, the socioeconomic metrics that we wanted to improve. And we would be giving, the program gives grant funding to the operators across the different components. So we had the standalone mini grids, we had standalone solar home systems, and then EPC for energizing education in universities and associated teaching hospitals. So across those we wanted to obviously increase socioeconomic and lifestyle benefits. So next slide, please. So essentially, as I had mentioned, it was supply side subsidies were the initial focus. And this was what we went into the program to do, with the private sector being incentivized to come up and increase energy access. So along the way, there were lessons learned, but just on the achievement. So the program has, despite it being a pilot, and obviously, as we all know, any challenges, lockdown, and all the rest of it, the program currently, can boast the achievement of over 113 completed and commissioned mini grids, over 1.4 million total solar home systems deployed, and grant funding given of over $194 million. So the program is making an impact. This has impacted over 7 million Nigerians. So we know that we're doing something right, but along the way, some of the things that we did learn, as I said, I'll go on to. So next slide, please. So the supply side is obviously comfortable enough. We're looking to increase and scale that up and continue to incentivize them. And talking of exit strategies, in terms of that supply side, it was one of the key considerations, and the main thing was to have an exit strategy. So our project implementation manual does allude to that, and the preferred option was to phase out the subsidy gradually. So year on year, we would reduce the percentages. That didn't necessarily happen that way. The program evolved in various ways, and we did sort of, as I mentioned also, that part of the consideration is to have flexibility. The program, you learn as you go along, the demands and the macroeconomic realities, you shift and you tweak the program as you go along. So much of that was done. So on the supply side, we had in the manual a gradual phase out process for it and continuously assessing the program. At the time, there was no demand side subsidy, so we did come into the demand side subsidy midway into the program. And obviously that was in recognition of the fact that we wanted to increase affordability to the most vulnerable. So with the demand side subsidy that came in midway, it was a 20% subsidy. on the solar home systems, 20% subsidy to the end user on the solar home system side. For the mini grid component, there really still isn't a demand side subsidy in place. So looking forward to the future program and seeing with the studies that we have commissioned how best we can continue to do that. So next slide, please. So yes, so we have now introduced the demand side subsidy based on the needs. And what were the things that we learned and how is it doing? So it did increase affordability, like that skyrocketed within a year. And there were loads more systems. Attesting to the fact is the fact that we have over 1.4 million systems sold. A lot of that, over 60% has gone into the rural areas, which obviously have less access, about 34% energy access, and typically are in the lower income bracket. So it has done its work, but I'd say part of the lessons we've learned is to actually articulate our exit strategy when we're doing it. So these are some of the things that we're going to look to putting into what we say is the follow-on program. Many of you already might know that, the DARES is coming with increased funding, and it's to build on the gains of NEP. So the gains were, yes, we've done the supply side, we have introduced a demand side. So what do we need to make it better? One of the things is to target it rather than have the flat 20%. We're having studies done to see, should we have a sort of tiered subsidy? How do we do it? Should we even look at the cash transfers, or do we subsidize the system? So these are all questions that haven't been answered until we get some feedback from the studies that have been commissioned, and knowing how we are going to continue to essentially reach the most vulnerable. And that is a key part of the lessons learned. Again, I've said being flexible to the program evolving. So we didn't start with demand side subsidies, but midway we introduced them and realized quite quickly that this would form a critical part of the program, a critical part of success, and increasing energy access to the right people. So we didn't want grant subsidies going to developers ending up in urban households who could already afford them. So that was a big lesson learned, and immediately, we adapted to that. Setting a subsidy exit timeline quite early, so it's transparent and it's well documented and all the stakeholders are in the know. So that's something else. As I mentioned, articulating the exit strategy, that's very key, because you don't want to just stop bang and then affordability is a problem, sales prices skyrocket and the market wobbles. So continuous stakeholder engagement, that's across all stakeholders. So as government, we're talking to government partners, the end users, continuously educating ourselves on where the most need is, where the critical intervention should be, and how we should go about doing it. Next slide, please. So yeah, essentially, recommendations which we are also looking to take on board. Sustainability is key. The earlier speakers have spoken about it. With sustainability at the heart of the decisions, everything else works around it. So how do you make sure that this lasts after the program? How do you make sure that it targets the right people? How do you make sure that you're doing it the right way? So as I mentioned before, setting that exit timeline is critical. And looking at the Bangladesh model, it's something that we could decide and say, look, over the years, we're going to scale it down and phase out gradually. And I suspect that might be, but without studies, that's just a personal opinion, that might be something that wouldn't rock the market as much, and set that exit timeline and gradually phase it out. Set the exit criteria, and again, be transparent, define those who are going to make this happen, and continuously monitor. So I think it shouldn't be cast in stone. If we realize that something has changed, macroeconomic realities, or for instance, a couple of major policies that have changed from this end. So we now have a new Electricity Act, which is significant, and also the removal of subsidies on electricity tariffs, or reducing. So these obviously will inform some of our decisions for the off-grid sector. So again, we're looking to the future and looking to say we do want to target more specifically and do it the best way we possibly can based on the studies. And we do think it's the way to go, essentially. And yeah, we'll see how we can best incorporate that once we have the scale-up program coming up. So I believe that should be my next slide, but I'll say next slide in case there's, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Landi. Really, really interesting. Also interesting to see what the, let's say, the cascading or the following up on steps were in your experiences. Starting with supply side support, then moving gradually to demand side support, and within that demand side support, then going to a further targeting to become as efficient as possible. I take two things from your presentation. I take more, but two main things. One is to articulate the exit strategy clearly to all the stakeholders, and also communicate about timelines, which is critically important. So thanks very much. Thanks to all the three speakers now. So before we move into Q&A, and I think there has been some activity in the chat already with some of the questions being posed and others being answered, and I think there are a couple unanswers that we pick up in Q&A. I would like to take you through two poll questions because we want to learn from you as well. And the first poll question is, what would, in your view at least, be the least market distorting approach for a demand-side subsidy exit? And we heard several approaches. We heard both from ITCOL, for instance, we heard that we moved from a narrow phase out to when we went to smaller solar home systems, to targeting the poor more properly. But also reducing the volume or the amount of subsidy per individual household in order to phase it out. So what we'd like to hear from you is to learn from you, in your view, what would be the approach that would distort the market the least when we phase out when we phase out demand side subsidies, so we can stop subsidies altogether when program goals are met. Should we start with a broader target group that will be narrowed towards phase out? Start with a higher subsidy, as I said, as it's been done in Bangladesh, and then reduce it gradually to phase out. Or in case the market needs further assistance, set up a permanent facility that would secure subsidy funding required in the long run. Brenda, how far are we with the answers coming in? Okay, so the least advisable answer is to stop subsidies once program goals are met, including also in situations, I presume, where exit strategies are articulated clearly, as Landi just presented. But I think the majority of the answers is in the last answer. Set up a permanent facility which secures subsidies in cases where that is still needed, I would say. If the project goals or markets goals and markets are able to reach out to the poorest customers on their own, then I would say there's no need for further subsidies. In case there is, then we need to have a permanent facility that needs to be financed after all as well. And then when it comes to let's say the mechanism of phasing out subsidies, both start with a broader target group and then narrow it to the more impoverished or the more vulnerable customer groups, or start with a higher subsidy that will gradually reduce to a lower subsidy, have more or less equal votes. So thanks. Maybe Brenda, we go to the next poll. Yeah, there it is. So the next poll and also the last poll is: how do you perceive the lifespan of subsidies in the energy access sector? What do you think? Is it the long-term solution, which we need to take into account from the start? Basically, there will always be need in order to maintain universal access to vulnerable population groups for subsidies. Should it be an intermediate support? Subsidies should continue as long as affordability remains a barrier to sustainable energy access. Or is it only a very short-term boost, and a subsidy should always have a targeted end date? So your views on this, please. Brenda, can you share the results with us? I think the least favorite option is in this case the short-term boost. There's definitely a need to prolong subsidies, whether it's the midterm or the long-term solution, in order to ensure that we will be able to reach out and maintain also universal access, also for vulnerable population groups. Whether that is an indefinite long-term solution, or I think I'm a bit flexible there. I take the intermediate support also as a longer-term solution. I think that's the overwhelming majority of the participants in the call that vote for that. Thank you very much. Then I think these were our polls. We take these back into the design of the framework. Let's move to questions and answers. So we got two ways. One is to put them in the chat. If you would like to have the word, Brenda, I'm not sure how we're going to do that, but probably write in the chat that you would like to have the word if you have a bit of a more elaborate question. And in any case, I'd go back to the chat questions that we have received. I see that many of them have already been answered. Let me go through the maybe a question to Lande, but I think it's also aimed to everybody in the panel. What percentage of the subsidy came from governments, and what percentage came from donors? So in other words, when it comes to end user subsidies, what do you see? What was your experience in the past? Is the majority coming from own funding from national governments or from regional governments, or is there a need for donor or concessional funding from the sector? Lande, you were addressed first. Maybe you can have a first answer to that.
Yes, so government is implementing the program with funding from the World Bank. So that was where the funding was. Government hasn't done it directly, but other programs, government has intervened. So potentially it could be something that government could do, and do some, maybe 50-50. But for us, it wasn't government, it was totally the developmental funding, 100%.
Yeah. Maybe Shruti, I would be curious, because it says diesel subsidies in India is an overwhelming amount of money that is needed. Was it all cross-subsidized within the Indian government, or was there also international funding involved?
So typically, all fossil fuel consumption subsidies, or the way you're using the term end user subsidies, they're all government. They are not coming in from any other source. So all for LPG, for diesel, for kerosene, the electricity, it's all being funded by the government. But on the clean energy side is where we start seeing this disaggregation of the government stepping in, the private players coming in, and international sort of funding sort of coming in to subsidize products. But we also see sometimes between the national and the subnational governments, they're also on the clean energy subsidies, they're also splitting. So for example, if you have a solar irrigation pump set, that is, and there's a large national rollout of that scheme. So like pump sets for farmers to irrigate their fields and powered through solar, there will be a breakup between the private, the developer, the subsidy split between three parts. So between the national government pitching in some, the state government or the subnational pitching in, electricity utility pitching in a little bit, because again, like what is their interest for them? The discoms are saving money by not supplying it to the farmers, because the farmers are getting free electricity. So they're interested in getting them off as well. So it's the interest of the stakeholder that comes in. But yeah, it can vary with different sectors.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ashraf, maybe a different question to you, also from the chat, and let me combine two. One is can you still hear me?
Yeah,
Okay, sorry. I think I was interrupted. Apologies. Ashraf, it's based on what data did you base?
Okay, we lost Marcel again. Or is it just me?
No, I think we lost it.
No, am I back?
Yes.
Apologies. There seems to be something wrong with my connection. I hope it holds now. Question again, third time. Based on what data did you base the phase out or decrease of the subsidy amount? So what was the trigger for phasing out or decreasing the subsidy amount? And maybe you could also explain the difference, was one of the questions, between the fee for service and the pay-as-you-go model.
Sure. So I will take the second question first, the fee for service and the pay-as-you-go model. So the fee for service model is a model that usually utilities follow. In our case, the BREB, who followed the fee for service model, but the ownership of the systems actually remained with the utilities or the REBs. Whereas the pay-as-you-go model is the model that we followed, although when we were implementing the pay-as-you-go terminology was not there. But the model that we followed is the pay-as-you-go, where after the payment of the full installment size, then the solar home system will become will be owned by the households themselves. So yeah, I hope that answers it. And thank you for the question as well. And for the first question, is based on what data? So in our program, we actually used real-time data that we received from the companies. So in every month, we actually sat down with the companies as part of our monitoring mechanism. And whenever we were designing a new subsidy or we were phasing out the subsidies, we always sat down, collected data from them, the real-time market data, and we also actually determined then that, well, this amount of subsidy is required at the household level, and these amount of subsidies are required at the institutional level. And then we subsequently phased it out. And we also did some studies over the period of time, based on which we determined that, okay, based on this market data, this amount of subsidies are required.
Thank you, Ashraf. And again, the chat box is still open for additional questions. I'll have another look at the list. Maybe an interesting one for Landa, but I think it's also a question that can be taken more general. So what happens if the prices of private sector suppliers are increased considerably? What does that do to the program? How do you deal with that? So the actual question was, what do you say to a recent increase in price by a major manufacturer of solar lanterns, almost doubling the price? How do you handle that as a program?
Exactly. So the thing is, we are getting to the end of the program, though of course it affects other components. And I started chatting before I started saying that a lot of the economic pointers that have brought us to this place are the first step in trying to solve the problem. Engaging with government and seeing how we can support the sector, because we can't change prices. They're based on the market realities. So what can we do within the scope of the policies to perhaps help assist those who are bringing in these goods? Nigeria is still very import dependent. So a first step might be to look at waivers. That hasn't been very popular in the past, because you get customs saying, well, where do we get our revenue from if we're giving waivers to everybody? But it's a discussion that needs to start coming back into the open, given almost doubling of prices. As a project, we're looking to see how potentially we can adjust the prices, the subsidy rates potentially, to make them more fit for purpose and to better help the developers. So again, studies are in place to see what that will throw up. And I think by early Q1 of 2024, we should have more of something will shed light on how we can intervene on our own part, and then also discuss with other parties on the best intervention to cope with this.
Yeah, No, thanks very much, Lande. Maybe I've got a question for the participants in the call, and particularly I would say the private participants in the call. What for you would be the key elements or the key considerations for demand side subsidy or for an end user subsidy to engage with? If you would have to provide, could you provide your recommendations to the framework that we're currently designing? And I think your answers can go easily in the chat, either now or in the next couple of minutes. And I believe we also have the option that we can give someone the word to explain it verbally as well. So I'd be curious to get some answers in the chat as to what are the main considerations for a private sector participant to engage in the demand side subsidy program, and what would be the main criteria that you would be interested in. There's an answer from Jesse Demucci saying that governments must be involved from the start, and perhaps having vulnerable community members involved in the design as well, in addition to the private sector. So what I take from that is that basically we say if we're going to design a DSS or an end user subsidy, then involve all stakeholders from the beginning of the design phase, and then take everybody's comments and recommendations on board. I get an amen. That's okay. And there's also a question related to the second poll, which asking the question: is the timing of the ending of the subsidy a key consideration? And I read on: subsidies historically for petrol or other services are long term. Is there any consideration in the exit strategy for stopping, and what are the criteria that would start them up again? Depending on political will and regulatory environment. But basically, if let's say, is the exit strategy general in when it comes to long-term subsidies, has then been taken on board from the beginning? And maybe Shruti, maybe you could give us your experience how that works with fossil fuel subsidies. Is that something that is taken on board from the beginning, although many of them are already really old? Or is that something that at some point in time is stated by the government when political will is dictating, or when financing is dictating that fossil fuel subsidies have to be phased down? How does that work in practice? At what point in time do governments engage in discussions around exit strategies? I think that's the gist of the question, by the way.
Thank you for that question. It's also a very hot question that comes up annually in international commitments, particularly around G7, G20, and then COP. You see it now on COP cover text decisions. And I think usually when, like, the short answer is usually governments think about subsidies and reforming them when it's too late. But often in the long term, three classic things really help. The first is, of course, a very gradual phase in. Like, so the prices, whatever you're doing, you have to do it over the long term. So exiting over the long term is always better than any big bang approach that sort of really exacerbates the impact on low-income households. So if they have any price shocks, any inflationary shocks, it really impacts the poorest the most. So any long-term gradual phase-in on prices is the way to go. With political willingness, regulatory checks have to be made all the time because governments tend to change frequently in emerging markets. And then with the changing governments, you have changing decisions. So unless it's locked in a regulatory format, it's too hard for the exit strategy to stick onto it. And with the last consideration on the timing is always getting the evidence if the subsidy is benefiting the poorest. So getting your poverty data, getting income data, end user data is really vital to understanding when the exit reform should be kicked in. Because you ideally want to sort of protect your poor households the most, and you want to have your mitigation sort of measures in place for that, you need to identify who is receiving the beneficiary and who needs the protection the most. So these sort of three things is really ideal to decide when an exit strategy should be taken.
Great, thank you very much, Shruti. Also considering time, I have one final question from Cecilia Costella, who says regarding the exiting strategy and government involvement, she would be interested in knowing if linking with existing government social programs at the end is an option. As in Europe, many energy subsidies are managed by social assistance agencies as well. But has there been any discussion, was there any consideration in either of the countries of the panelists to move the specific energy subsidies to a social program? Are you experienced with that? I think you're nodding, Shruti. I'm not sure whether that's correct.
I'm nodding because this is what the recommendation is, to support the people and not the fuel. So you're not locked into a fossil fuel, and rather than sort of being again and again like subsidizing the fuel, you ideally protect the poor. So you directly benefit or transfer the subsidy benefits to the poor, and whether they use it for a fossil fuel or a clean energy fuel is a matter up to the household, whatever is accessible and affordable to them. But at the same time, that typically doesn't work. What works is in making sure that the database of beneficiaries is the same across different social programs. So it's the same set of beneficiaries who are accessing LPG subsidies and accessing other social welfare programs. And there's a single institution which is responsible for this database of beneficiaries that will help with the final exiting. But is it done now? No, it's not done now. Other cases of it being done, yes, it's constantly being pushed, but we haven't seen a great many successes.
Thanks. Ashraf, I see you would like to weigh in as well, please. Go ahead.
Yes, so we actually do have an experience of linking our program with the social safety program of the government. So we have been doing it, we have done it since 2014, but we actually also strictly monitored that there are actually no overlaps and it is not distorting the market, because oftentimes we have seen that the social safety net programs actually distort the markets because the subsidies are higher than what any commercial programs are offering. So ITCOL, through our participating organizations, we actually implemented both these programs parallelly and linked it, but with very strict monitoring that through the social safety net program, the poor and the ultra poor households are actually receiving higher subsidies, and it is not distorting the market.
Thanks very much. Considering time, I think we've come to the end. I'm not going to summarize all the things I heard and all the lessons I learned. Just a couple of remarks. One is that when it comes to demand side subsidies, there are actually really good examples in the sector out there. It's encouraging to see that they're being shared here already, but also, as I also commented on Ashraf's presentation, also into other countries, taking advantage of the lessons learned that were made in Bangladesh, but also in other countries. And one important aspect I think that needs to be repeated time and again is to be predictable and communicate and take stakeholders on board in a very early stage on both, let's say, the design of the strategy, but in particular also on the exit of the strategy, because that's how, if I were a private sector operator, I would have to base my business model and make my business decisions upon. And it's also, I think, very valuable for potential customers to see when, where, and what type of subsidies they can claim. So with that, I really would like to thank the speakers of today, Shruti, Ashraf, and Lande. I also like to thank the organizers of today, and the organizers of the End User Subsidy Lab. And of course, last but not least, I would like to thank all the participants of today for their input, for their questions. I think further input is still welcome. I think it can be conveyed through the Gogla site. The website, the webinar can be looked back for those who still have missed some things. I would like to repeat it. And as the slide says at the end, do reach out with any questions or any suggestions that you have. So with that, I would like to close the webinar and thank everybody for their participation.